So this is one of the newts, and the other one, which I think I'm going to pan over to in a second. There it is right there. That's actually its foot and its head. And you can see for yourself, that's what they did. They either fought the current or they hung out in the eddy where they didn't have to fight the current. So suddenly, we make crossbeds, and it explains all the fossil footprints we have in the Coconino. Okay, I'll cover this real quick. Again, my favorite anti-creationist, Dr. Derek Ager, he tried to explain why the tracks only went uphill. He said, well, it's simple. The tracks on the windward side of the dune were destroyed. So the only tracks that were preserved were those that were on the lee side. That explains why they only go uphill. That makes no sense at all if you stop and think about it. That means the animals only ever walked in one direction in the desert. Makes no sense. But another person also suggested tracks going uphill are the only ones that make tracks. In other words, if you walk down a sand dune, you're not going to preserve tracks. Again, nonsense. When you take a look at white sands, you can see tracks going uphill, downhill, across the dunes, all over the place. I went over to the sand dunes, I walked up the sand dune, and I walked down the sand dune. You can judge for yourself. There's the ones going down, there's the ones going up. This is science. I felt silly doing it, to be honest, but I had to make the point. But here's the catch. Uniformitarian assumptions are slipped in when you're not looking. These are sand dunes, not crossbeds. And that is uniformitarian tactic number 54. Slip in the assumptions when not looking, okay? Now, again, the anti-creationists bring this up. They say it has to be fossil sand dunes. After all, we have fossil spider tracks. And these are supposedly fossil spider tracks. They call them octopoda because nobody really knows what they are. Others have quoted fossil scorpion tracks in the Coconino sandstone. That might be a problem for a global flood. How do you have these crossbeds being made by water with scorpion footprints and spider tracks on them? Okay, so what about the spider tracks? Number one, even tarantula spiders are incredibly light. You can put them on your arm and you'd hardly know they were there. They're not heavy enough to make spider fossil footprints. However, the sea spider is. There's a sea spider. Personally, I think that's the culprit for these fossil footprints. Again, it is not evidence of a desert. It is evidence of a global flood. And what about the scorpion tracks? Well, assuming they are scorpion tracks, we've also found scorpion tracks on Ellesmere Island in the Canadian Arctic. Fossil scorpion footprints. Down in Joggins, Nova Scotia, on the east coast, we found, get this, lizards, sharks, a coelacanth, which is a big fish, Spirorbis worms, which is a brackish water worm, horseshoe crabs, again a marine organism, giant sow bugs called the Arthropleura, and a damselfly. We've also found, get this, amphibians, just like the Coconino tracks, and a fossil scorpion. Nobody is claiming those are deserts. It can all be explained within the context of a global flood. Now, what I want to focus on today is the present cannot be the key to the past. Now, this comes from my homeland, my mother country, Canada. Eastern Ontario, this is on the Bruce Peninsula. This comes from a fellow by the name of Douglas Cox, a creationist. And these are giant wave ripples. And if you look carefully, that is actually a road. And this is another road. So this is an aerial shot. And if you look closely, you see what looks like wave ripples that you would normally see on a beach. Except these wave ripples are about 300 feet crest to crest. Those are big wave ripples. That takes a lot of water, a lot of fast-moving water. But it gets better than this. Last year, when I was flying home from Alberta, I took a more northern route, just north of Winnipeg. Once again, looking out the window, giant wave ripples. Here's a close-up. I'm going to show you what it looks like in NASA Whirlwind in a second. I actually went and studied those wave ripples after I spotted those from the airplane. If you're looking in Google Earth or NASA Whirlwind, they're pretty easy to find. You look in Canada, here's Hudson's Bay. And down here in Manitoba are two large lakes. So we're going to zoom in on those lakes. They're Lake Winnipeg and Lake Winnipegosis. So there's Lake Winnipeg and Lake Winnipegosis. When you find them, the wave ripples are primarily in here, but they're also up in here off to the left. They're actually up to 50 feet high crest to trough. They are a mile crest to crest. And as you can see, they're spread out widthwise hundreds of miles. This is not some little stream that happened to breach a small dam somewhere. This is a major catastrophe, a major water flow. This isn't some ice age dam that broke. This requires a global flood. The evidence is all around us. This is another place in Canada. This is on the Cypress Hills, on the border of Alberta and Saskatchewan. Doesn't look like much, does it? It's flat, really flat. You're actually on top of a mountain here, a mountain of rocks, and it has been planed flat across the top by fast-moving water. And when you take a look just below the surface, there's the flat surface up top, and this has actually been eroded by water and a road. They actually built a road through there. And you'll notice that it's covered in these rounded quartzite rocks with these percussion marks. And I'll pass this rock around so you can see for yourself. What you want to look at is all these strange round hammer marks that are all over the rock, and we call those percussion marks. Okay, so I'm going to pass this rock around, if you could. We'll start here. Now, a lot of these rocks, this is actually still a medium-sized one. This is not that. There are others that are much bigger than this, as I'll show you in a second. And hopefully the camera will be able to pick up these percussion marks. But the key here is, in order to make these hammer marks, the rock has to actually be picked up by the water and carried in suspension. Now, I have a hard time picking that rock up with my hands and carrying it. For water to do that, get this, the water has to be moving for a rock this size. The water has to be moving at least 70 to 75 miles an hour. That's pretty fast water. It has to be at least 100 feet deep in order to pick the rocks up enough to drop them and hammer them against each other in order to make these percussion marks. Now that's for a rock this size. However, when I was in British Columbia, I found some rocks this size. Same rock, same percussion marks visible on the rock, and this rock is called quartzite. It's basically sand that has been compressed under tremendous heat and pressure and fused together into a very hard rock. So these quartzite boulders are all over the West Coast. Where are we here? We're in Illinois. I met a guy here at this very church last year who found some in Minnesota. And he recognized the rocks right away with the percussion marks and everything, and he was asking about it. So if you keep your eyes open and you find any, do let me know, because we're actually mapping where these are found. So if you find any, please do let me know. They are all over the West Coast. Now here's the catch. The way they have to be carried, by water, moving very, very rapidly, picks them up, and as it's moving them along, they hammer against each other, both rounding them and making the percussion marks. But the ones in Alberta did not come from Alberta. When we take a look at what they call the paleocurrents, we can tell which way the water was flowing. The paleocurrents tell us that it actually came from the direction of Idaho. But the nearest outcrop of that type of rock is some 800 kilometers away. That would be what, about 600 miles, give or take? So these rocks were ripped up from their host rock in Idaho. They traveled downhill a whopping 2 degrees downhill, not much downhill. They traveled 2 degrees downhill for about 600 miles, moving along at 75 miles an hour, held in suspension by water, and deposited in Alberta. This is a global catastrophe. All this happened 4,500 feet above sea level. Now let me explain why this is significant, other than the fact that it takes a heck of a lot of fast-moving water. To give you an idea, the water falling over Niagara Falls falls 150 feet, and it finally hits about the 65, 70 mile an hour mark after falling vertically for 150 feet. The fastest flash flood that I've ever heard of is actually the Brazos River in Texas, which I visited regularly, very famous for dinosaur tracks. The Brazos River has been recorded at hitting a whopping 35 miles per hour during its fastest flash floods. These speeds are so far off the chart that it's mind-boggling. It is profound evidence for a global flood. Now, this isn't too far away. This is down in Montana. These are the Beartooth Mountains. They cross over the Montana-Wyoming border. Now, I showed you the Cypress Hills, the top of it was flat, right? Well, it's hard to see here because it's down below, but this is also perfectly flat right across the top. But these mountains are solid granite. And again, everyone agrees the top has been planed flat by fast-moving water. That is 8,000 feet above sea level. How do you plane a solid granite mountain flat across the top, 8,000 feet above sea level, with fast-moving water without flooding the rest of the planet? You can't. Plain and simple. Again, more profound evidence just from geology showing that there has been a global flood. The present cannot be the key to the past. We do not have water picking up quartzite in Idaho and transporting it 700 kilometers at 75 miles an hour. And if it did, it would be a study in catastrophe. And it's a study, I don't know about you, I don't think I'd want to do that study. I think I'll try and avoid that one. You do not get mountains being planed flat across the top by fast-moving water 8,000 feet above sea level. And if we did, it would be a study in catastrophe, not long and slow geologic processes. Now, today, all around you, you see erosion. Riverbeds, stream beds, channels, etc. It's very easy to see. You can see it all around you. Yet, when you take a look at the rock layers, it's gone. It's not there. We also see things like soils. And soils grow very quickly. They accumulate very quickly. Yet, when we look at the rock record, they are gone. There isn't any. These rock layers in the Grand Canyon are supposed to have taken hundreds of millions of years. Yet we can have soils that grow in 10 years or less. Very healthy, organically rich soils. Even in the desert, you can get soils very quickly accumulating. Yet they're completely gone from the geologic record. All that erosion, millions of years. Think about it. We can see streams and rivers carving out canyons and gorges today with our own two eyes. It's not a slow process, yet it is completely gone from the geologic record. That is not an indicator that the geologic record took a long time. It is actually an indicator it happened fast. This is a Banff National Park in Canada. Again, close-up look at the layers. No erosion, no soils. Where did it all go? Or maybe it's not the erosion in soils that's missing. Maybe it's the deep time that's assumed that is actually missing. And again, this all comes back to the whole idea of the old Earth. Yesterday I mentioned Joggins. This is the only place on planet Earth I have ever heard anybody claim that there are erosion in the layers. And this is an example. You can see the rock layers coming here. It bows down and then goes off again horizontal. Many have claimed these are eroded riverbed channels. However, if you recall yesterday I showed you interbedding. That's all this is. It is very clear that the current went across the channel. We're supposed to be looking up and down through as if we were standing in the stream bed looking upstream. That's what we're supposed to be looking at. But when you look at the geology, it is clear the current was going across the channel, not up and down it. Once again, evidence that's claimed to be evidence of deep time turns out to actually support catastrophe. These layers were formed catastrophically by sheet flow, producing these strange erosional features that were actually made sideways, not by water going downhill. Okay, where's my water? There's my water. Okay, now something else you'll notice, and again, anybody can do this. Anybody can do this as you take a look at the world around you. Again, going on the assumption that the geologic record has taken hundreds of millions of years to form. All right, let's put that to the test. As the layers are laid down, if you recall Steno's 4 principles, one of them was original horizontality. In other words, the layers were laid down horizontally. They're flat. Now, over hundreds of millions of years, well, even just within our time frame, we can actually watch, observe, and measure the land tilting, buckling, folding. All this is going on right before us. Just head down to California and take a look at things like the San Andreas Fault. You can see faulting and a fracturing of the land. So can you imagine amplifying that over millions of years? So over hundreds of millions of years, the land is going to tilt, buckle, fold, fault. It's going to do all kinds of stuff. So let's say it just tilts. Let's just go on that. Then, when the next layers come in, obviously, you're going to actually be able to see the tilt because the new layers are laid horizontally. And so at least one or more of those layers are actually going to be thicker on one end than the other. Do you follow me so far? Follow? Okay, good. Okay. It's kind of hard to get across, so hopefully you understand it. Now let's apply this to real life with a bit of math. Math is important, especially for you young guys back there. Okay? Trigonometry comes in surprisingly handy. Okay? Now, here we are in the Grand Canyon. Easily, anywhere in the Grand Canyon, you can see 10 miles or more left to right, easily. So when you look at the layers, you can see up to 10 miles in width or more, sometimes up to 15 or 18 miles, depending on where you are. It is just incredibly vast. But this does an excellent example for what I want to show you next. Assuming that these layers took hundreds of millions of years, I don't believe that for 1 second, but let's give them that for a second, we should see a difference in thickness in the layers from this side to this side. Makes sense, doesn't it? You should see a change somewhere. Instead, you see none at all. All of the layers are perfectly parallel to each other. That tells you essentially they were all laid down in a short amount of time. Now here's where the math comes in. Let's assume that the land tilted 1 degree. You'd be able to see it, but it's not much of a tilt. Within a 10-mile view, you've got a layer that's 10 mile wide. You've got a slope 52,800 feet long. There's 5,280 feet per mile, 10 miles. Your layer would be 921 feet thicker at one end than the other. Now, applying that to the Grand Canyon, one of the thickest formations in the Grand Canyon is the Redwall limestone. It's only about 500 feet thick. So as you stand on the north rim of the Grand Canyon and look out, the Redwall limestone should vanish within sight if the land had tilted a mere 1 degree during those supposed hundreds of millions of years. Obviously, it didn't tilt. I would argue this is evidence that it happened fast and did not take hundreds of millions of years. Again, at Joggins, same thing, only it's amplified. 18,000 vertical feet of layers have been laid down, and every single one of them is perfectly parallel to the last. For 18,000 feet. By the way, you remember Charles Lyell yesterday suggested perhaps the land could sink and water could wash in and deposit layers? You remember that? Some of you do. Okay, good. Some of you weren't here apparently, yeah? Okay, yeah, I'll leave it at that. Okay. Well, in this case, we've got 18,000 vertical feet. Wait a minute. If the land sinks 18,000 vertical feet, do you think that causes a flood? If the water went up 18,000 feet, does that not also cause a flood? How can you sink the land 18,000 feet without flooding the entire continent? Ain't going to happen. We are talking global catastrophe. It's nonsense to suggest that the land just sunk and that was what caused the deposition of Joggins. Okay, I'm going to get a little technical on you. This is some more first-hand research I did. I presented a paper at the first Creation Geology Conference this past year on this subject. I'll be publishing later on it in more detail. This is a group of fossil polystrates calamites. Now, yesterday I mentioned just briefly that as we take a look through the fossil record, everything in the past was larger than it is today. Now, as an example, this is a plant. Some of you may recognize it already. It's called the horsetail. I don't know if anybody recognizes that or not. I don't have much left. But this is a horsetail, also known as the horsetail rush. The reason they called it a scouring rush is because it actually has a lot of calcite in it, and they used to use these for cleaning pots and pans in the olden days. So the scouring rush, again, still grows today. Today it might get 2-3 feet tall. But in the fossil record, this same plant got up to the height of 2 telephone poles. To give you an example, there's the modern version, and here is the fossil version. The difference in size is astronomical. What on earth happened here? And I'm going to get into that later on, trying to explain why everything has drastically reduced in size. Cattails, you've probably seen cattails. Bulrushes grow in swamps today. How tall do they get nowadays? Yeah, 4 or 5 feet, maybe 6. I've seen some 8 feet, but that's pretty rare. That same plant, again, up to 60 feet tall in the fossil record. Why? What on earth happened? Now, these fossil plants also tell a story. These fossil plants, when you find them at Joggins, are upright, as I showed you yesterday. They're buried vertically in the rock. This is a group of 10 of them. So every single one of those yellow arrows, they're actually foam tags that I actually pin into the rocks for photographs. Every single one of those arrows points to a polystrate calamites plant. Now, interestingly, these two right here were what caught my attention. I think I have a close-up of them. Yes, I do, right there. You'll please notice that they are actually, while they're polystrate, they bend and then come around in an arch. They are actually bent in unison in a counterclockwise ascending spiral. In fact, all 10 of them are. There's only one explanation for that, and that is that the layers, after they were all buried, the layers shifted relative to each other, and it bent the plants within them. Now, why on earth would it do that? Everyone agrees that all the Joggins cliffs, all the layers were deposited before the whole thing tilted on its side, and that's the only time the layers could have shifted relative to each other. So 18,000 feet of dirt piled on top of it, then shifted relative to each other. The plants were still green at that time. You think a plant's going to stay green for tens of millions of years? I don't think so. They were still green and flexible and buried in the dirt, and they got bent in unison. Another interesting point, please notice that it has got a vertical fracture in it. And if you look at the vertical fracture, it is also bent in a counterclockwise ascending spiral. A helix, if you will, a helical spiral. So if you're looking from the bottom, everything goes in this direction. Okay? So this is now, 1,000 feet below what I just showed you and about 2,000 feet away. So it's not like they're in the same layer. It's the whole formation is like this. The front has fallen off it, but take a look what's inside. Inside, there is a pithy core. It's something like a grapefruit. It's got a similar inside to the plant. Inside that, you know how a grapefruit has a core to it? Sort of right in the middle? Well, inside, that core, again, got bent in a counterclockwise ascending spiral. Everything in the Joggins formation somehow got twisted by the sedimentary layers shifting relative to each other. What on earth would do that? How can it do that? It makes no sense. In the exact same layer, here we are, only 30 feet away. You'll notice this one, fractured in a counterclockwise ascending spiral, fractured in a counterclockwise ascending spiral. If you lay them out, here they are, they're all in the exact same stratigraphic layer, about 50 feet apart, but they are all twisted and fractured in precisely the same way. This is obviously not the plants doing this. This is something else, the shifting of the sediments. But when you take a look at this one that I showed you yesterday, pay close attention to what the trunk does. It comes out and left, back and right, out and left, back and right, and then out again, coming in a counterclockwise ascending spiral. That branch, notice it's bent in a counterclockwise ascending spiral. The whole tree, 30 feet tall, is actually twisted into a big helical spiral. Now, over a 5-year study period, this is what I documented. I documented 102 polystrate plants. Of those, 43, there wasn't enough exposed, or it was so damaged you couldn't tell, or way up too high on the cliffs, whatever. 43 of those, I couldn't make any assessment. I couldn't tell if it was twisted or not. Of the remaining 59, 29 of those, or roughly half, about 50% of those, had a clear counterclockwise ascending helical spiral exhibited in them. Of those, a further 18 probably did, but again, there wasn't quite enough exposed or whatever. I had a reason for caution. If you include all of those, as much as 80% of the upright plants were all twisted in unison in a clockwise ascending spiral, or a counterclockwise ascending spiral. 10 of them had no spiraling, they were straight, and at least one had a counterclockwise ascending spiral. Or clockwise. There I go, I'm getting them mixed up again. Anyway. And 2 possibly did. Now here's what this all boils down to. Why did this happen? And the analogy I will be making is towards tornadoes, because that's the only analogy I can make. Tornadoes and what we call colks, which are an underwater tornado, basically. You've probably seen colks. If you stand on the side of a fast-moving river, you can see the little tornadoes, the little funnels in the water. That's a colk. Okay, so similar analogy. This is the mid-oceanic ridge in the ocean. It is actually the longest mountain chain in the world, and we're going to talk about that mountain chain later on when I bring out this globe, and we're going to explain why the global flood happened. Actually show a mechanism for how it happened, and it's a fascinating study. But the mid-oceanic ridge, this gigantic mountain range, is also fractured left to right. And what happens is in the northern hemisphere, that fracture, you've got the range going like this and cracks going sideways, but the cracks are curved. In the northern hemisphere, they curve to the left. In the southern hemisphere, the crack curves to the right. And at the equator, it's disturbed. They go all directions at the equator as it rides along the equator for a long period of time. The explanation is quite obvious. This was in an article published by Jürgen Friedrich and Guy Leduc. The answer to this is obvious. It's the Coriolis effect. An article a few years ago on water gaps, it was just baffling. He said it's as if some of the water seeks obstacles to transect. It's as if the water took a turn specifically so it carved its way through a mountain. It's as if it looked for things to cut in half. It could have gone the easy way around the mountain, as any water normally would. Why would it do this? What on earth happened?